Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is the series of lectures that I'm videotaping for History 101, Europe and the World Part 1. And we are talking today about the Renaissance. And I just finished talking about how one of the activities of Renaissance thinkers and writers was to collate the manuscripts of great ancient Greek, and maybe not even not so great ancient Greek and Latin works that had not been printed because there was no printing press, and therefore in the hand recopying of the manuscripts in one copy after another, and different copies would end up in different parts of Europe where they would be more mistakes would be made in different ways. Somebody like Petrarch would get together the different manuscripts of a particular work and try to come up with a manuscript which was as close as possible to what they thought the original manuscript must have been before people started making mistakes. Petrarch was also a poet, probably more famous today as a poet. I have in your source book on page 24 a couple of poems by Petrarch. On the left you have the original Italian, and on the right you have the English translation. An English translation, of course. There were various ones, and people are still making translations of Petrarch. I wrote a translation of a Petrarch poem once and gave it to my roommate Massimo Manella to read, and Massimo kind of gave me this look and said, "I don't read Petrarch in translation." Because he was an Italian, he could read it in the original Italian, so I never got his opinion on my translation of it. Both of these poems are in a form called the sonnet. And in fact, Petrarch wrote hundreds of sonnets, and there is something today that we call the Petrarchan sonnet, in contrast with the Shakespearean sonnet. You probably know that Shakespeare also wrote a lot of sonnets. And the Petrarchan sonnet and the Shakespearean sonnet have details that are different, but generally speaking, they are the same form, and you can see this form in the Petrarchan sonnet. You've got all sonnets are 14 lines long. They begin with a section that is 8 lines long, and then a section that is 6 lines long. The 8-line section is divided into 2. The 6-line section is also divided into 2. And in each of these sections, there is a rhyme pattern in which, for each of the, up here in the 4-line section, you've got 2 rhyme endings. In other words, cat and mat, and then dog and bog. And then you have in the concluding 6 lines, you've got 3 rhyme pairs that are not necessarily confined to the 3-line sections, but are confined to the 6-line sections. Also, the sonnet has a certain number of syllables to each line. So this is a very restricted, sort of like classical ballet. If you don't do it right, it's not ballet. And if you're writing something and it doesn't fit the sonnet form, it's not a sonnet. So Petrarch writes hundreds of these poems that fit a very precise logical structure. But in the poems, he expresses some very violent emotions. I used to try and read the Italian poem version of the Petrarch, and the ghost of Massimo Manella was always hovering over my shoulder and saying, "You don't even try." So I'm going to read you the English translation of it, which you can also find here in your source book. "I find no peace, and have no arms for war, and fear, and hope, and burn, and yet I freeze, and fly to heaven, lying on earth's floor, and nothing hold, and all the world I seize. My jailer opens not, nor locks the door, nor binds me to her, nor will loose my ties. Love kills me not, nor breaks the chains I wear, nor wants me living, nor will grant me ease," in other words, letting me die. "I have no tongue, and shout, eyeless I see, I long to perish, and I beg for aid. I love another, and myself I hate. Weeping, I laugh, I feed on misery, by death and life so equally dismayed. For you, my lady, am I in this state? Well, there are several things you can say about this particular poem. Even to begin with, he's discussing the same subject that were discussed a couple of centuries before by poets called the troubadours. One of the typical things that a troubadour would talk about. I haven't talked about troubadours very much in these video lectures because I would have to use recordings that are under copyright, I don't want to end up in jail. But troubadours would always write songs about how, oh, I'm in love with you, and I know it's hopeless because you will never pay any attention to me. You are so far above me, and but I still love you anyway. So will you just permit me to kneel at your feet and suffer from this unrequited love? In troubadour times, what this often was a way of praising your patroness, who was, it was a queen, probably, who was married to a king, and you can't really make a pass at a queen when the king is in the room, but you can make this sort of idealized, oh, you beautiful lady, if you could only be mine, but I know that can never be, so I will just worship you from afar. Petrarch personalizes this. You read his poems and he's not talking about just some abstract female figure. He's talking about somebody that he really knew. We're not quite sure who it was. One candidate, by the way, is an ancestor of the Marquis de Sade, which is kind of interesting. But what is interesting to me about this poem is he has these very passionate, sort of chaotic, tumultuous feelings. He's contradicting himself all the way through the poem. It's as if he isn't making any sense at all. But then he writes the poem in this very strict, formalized art form of the sonnet. And in some ways, to me, that's very typically Renaissance, because what he's basically saying is that as human beings, we have all of these crazy emotions that we don't know what to do with. I mean, we're still in this time when sexuality is not something that we can make any kind of sense out of. It's just some kind of feeling that we feel. But he says, although I cannot make sense out of my feelings, I can express them to you in a way that makes sense. I can express them to you in this highly refined, very intellectual form of the sonnet. And in that way, I can't exactly reduce the world to order, but I can make a kind of order that will stand in its own, that will express the craziness of the world, but will also have a refinement and stability of its own in terms of the strict order that it maintains. So this is one aspect, certainly, of the Renaissance. Petrarch is a classic example of Renaissance thought and literature. Another who illustrates an aspect of the Renaissance that is in some ways very new is a female author, Christine de Pizan. There are a couple of people that we've talked about since the beginning of the course who are female, who are also great writers, Sappho and Anna Komnene, the great historian of the Byzantine Empire. But generally speaking, women don't have an important place in European literature before the Renaissance. But we begin to see them emerging. And one of them is this woman named Christine de Pizan. Very interesting character. She started out her life married to a member of the nobility. Looked like she was going to spend her whole life just, raising children and doing the things that medieval women had done. But then her husband dies. She doesn't have any money. She has to make a living. So she travels around Europe to various courts, and the kings and queens give her money to write books. You get the impression that she's sort of, in a way, she's like a freak show, because it's like, a woman? How could a woman write a book? Well, that'll be fun. Let's invite her to our court and see if she can actually do it. And most of her books are, stories about chivalric and knighthood and romance and things like that. But she does write an interesting book that I have a copy of in my library in translation, called The Book of the City of Ladies. And the plot of the Book of the City of Ladies is that, it's in the first person. like Dante's poem. And you can assume the person who is telling the story is Christine de Pizan. And she's sitting in her library saying, oh, well, oh me, I'm just a poor woman. I'm never going to accomplish anything. Everybody knows that women are not as good as men, and I might as well just give it up. And then an angel flies through the window, as so often happens, and says, you are wrong, Christine. Women are amazing. And I'm going to tell you examples of some of the women who have been important throughout history. It's sort of like, again, it's sort of like Dante's Divina Commedia, because she goes into a list of famous women in history, and for each woman, she talks about the things that they did. And, sometimes the things they did are things that we would not consider to be so wonderful today. I mean, she talks about women who had really awful husbands that beat them and things like that. And she says, oh, these women are so wonderful because they put up with it. Is that a wonderful thing? Who knows? But the point of the book, and it's an interesting point, is that women are just as good as men. Women can do all sorts of wonderful things. And again, this is very typical for the Renaissance, because as I discuss in my video about the Reformation, one of the big themes of the Renaissance is that human beings are wonderful people who are capable of doing all sorts of great stuff. St. Augustine had this idea that, we're all miserable sinners and we don't even know how to figure out which is right and which is wrong, and we need to have rulers sent from God to tell us what to do. But as I point out in the lecture on the Reformation, there's a guy named Pico della Mirandola, whom I discuss in more detail there, who says, that's not right. God created men, and according to Christine de Pizan, women, to be able to do anything. There are no limits to the things that we are able to achieve because human beings are so wonderful. So, Christine de Pizan, she's still an exception in the Renaissance. There are not lots and lots and lots of women who write in the Renaissance, but Christine de Pizan is basically sticking up for the ability of women to do the kinds of things that men do. One of the things that people often say about the Renaissance is that it was an agnostic or even pagan period. They say that the Renaissance authors were rejecting Christianity and rejecting religion because they saw the Greek and Roman writers. They didn't go back to worshiping the Greek and Roman gods. That's one thing that didn't happen in the Renaissance. But they look back on the Greeks and the Romans and they say, well, they didn't believe in the Christian God or the Jewish God, and they still managed to accomplish a lot of wonderful stuff. This is the question that came up when Aristotle was first being reintroduced to Europe. And Moses ben Maimon answered by saying, well, yeah, it doesn't mean that Christianity is bad, but certainly the pagan authors did a lot of wonderful things that are worth looking at. And today, scholars look back at the Renaissance and say, well, these, Renaissance people of the 1300s and 1400s and 1500s were just kind of throwing Christianity over the side of the boat. And that's not really what happens. There are Christian humanists. Even today, you hear the word humanism, Christian fundamentalists who don't like anything about modern life will use the word humanism as a kind of humanism versus Christianity. They say that the humanists who are depending on science and logic and all that bad stuff are not really honoring Christianity the way it should be. And I'm here to tell you, and Thomas Aquinas is here to tell you too, and some of the Christian humanists of the Renaissance, that humanism and Christianity can very well be compatible. Most of these evangelicals who are telling you that humanism is atheistical, anti-Christian stuff probably never even heard of Thomas Aquinas, so they're operating out of ignorance. But let me start a third tape here.